How do we eliminate those discriminatory practices that particularly affect women when it comes to applying for jobs? Kate Glazebrook is the founder of Applied, a British-based company that looks at ways to make hiring processes inclusive as possible. And she joins me now from London. Kate, thanks for being with us. Can you give me an outline of how gender discrimination, even in 2018, still affects company hiring practices?
Over the last sort of 50 to 100 years, campaigners and activists have spent a lot of time thinking about ways of removing structural biases, so the things that literally stop women from applying or progressing in organisations. And yet, even in 2018, we see that there are about twice as many FTSE 100 bosses called David or Steve as there are women. And as you showed in your last segment, the gender pay gap continues to persist. In the UK, we see it's at about 18%. So some of the reasons why this still exists comes down to actually the way the brain works, and an increasing body of evidence seems to point to the impact of unconscious biases on the way that we select and promote people within organisations, which together contributes to a kind of increasing or at least no diminution in the gender inequalities that we see in organisations. So some of the reasons why that exists is that we all have a tendency to sort of hire and promote people who look and feel a bit like us, or what the researchers call affinity bias. But also we know that organisations reflecting a more male-based environment tends to influence the way that people think about their opportunity to apply to and advance in other organisations. So we absorb the world around us, and that affects the way that we see, as women, our opportunities to advance in organisations. And that all operates, importantly, at an unconscious level.
So, Kate, can you give me some specific examples of companies that you've been working with?
So we've been working with organisations on basically breaking down their hiring processes and building them back up, taking into account what we know works for removal of bias within hiring processes. And some of the ways in which we do that is even looking at things like job descriptions. So what are the words that you use in your job description? What does that signal about who you're actually looking for? So there's studies that show, for example, that certain types of words are coded almost as masculine or feminine coded words, and that job applicants respond to the presence of these kinds of words. So lots of masculine coded words like individual, lead and analytical tends to actually put off some female candidates from applying to the job because they perceive them to be very male-dominated environments. Some people think that this is just about women not being confident with those skills, but actually some of the research seems to suggest it's more that they feel that they won't belong.
So what does it take to establish a valid selection process?
So at the moment, we haven't really looked at the way that we do hiring. So about 100 years ago, we were hiring on the basis of CV and some form of a cover letter. And astonishingly, that's still what we do. When in actual fact, a lot of the research now points to just test candidates on the kinds of things they're actually going to do in the day job. That's far more predictive of finding the right person for the job. But it has the benefit of being far more inclusive as well, because it doesn't care so much where you learnt the skill, but that you have the skill at all. So let's take an example of women on maternity leave. Lots of women come to me and say, actually, while I'm on maternity leave, I feel like I'm learning better skills in negotiation and time management than I could ever be learning on a work-based environment. But I feel like when I'm applying to jobs, the fact that I've had this time out of the workforce is hurting me. And unfortunately, a lot of the data suggests that typically it does. But instead, if you test candidates on, hey, we've got a job that requires loads of negotiation, here's a challenge you might face in this job, what would you do? That female candidate is just as likely to score very well on a skills-based assessment of her than somebody who might have the official title of a negotiator in their last job. So it's actually about recasting what you're looking for and focusing on skill rather than on profile.
We often hear a lot about the fake imposter syndrome that many women suffer from, believing that somehow you're not deserving of a particular job or not worthy of applying for a new position. Again, what can employees do on an individual basis, but at the same time, what can employers do to encourage more women to apply?
A lot of it is about seeing is believing. So organisations can make a lot more out of the fact that they might actually have a more diverse workforce than is known outside of the organisation, and demonstrating to candidates coming in that actually there are senior females in this organisation, and here's what they do. For candidates themselves, it's actually about being willing to put yourself forward a little bit more. But I'm a big believer that a lot of this can come down to just smarter practices by employers that want to do the right thing. So most employers have absolutely the intention to make sure they're selecting the best candidate and avoid any of the biases that we've talked about in the past. But some of the practices that they currently use, unfortunately, doesn't get to the bottom of that. So it's not sufficient to just say we have a diverse workforce. It's actually about the way that you do those hiring practices and removing the bias right from the get-go. So some of those kinds of things include making sure when you list out the requirements for a job, is everything that's under the essential criteria actually essential for the job? Because research suggests that women are less likely to apply where there's a very long list of things in that job description. Not necessarily because they don't think they have the skills for the job, but that it seems that women are more likely to believe that that's a real requirement, that they are more sort of rules-oriented than men might be, where men might be slightly more likely to take a punt. So being really deliberate and practiced in the way that you design your processes and sort of designing out from the environment the bias that might creep in does a huge amount to kind of overcome the inequalities that we see in the workforce.
Kate, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Annette.